Hi, in this video we will talk about the characters in the Shining movie. What we will try to do is to better understand the dynamic of these characters and the relationships between them. And to better understand what is in this movie, we will use the defense mechanisms that we will see throughout the scenes. So first, defense mechanism that we have talked about in the previous video is repression. Repression can be seen in two very important pictures that are key to the movie. On the left we see frozen Jack in the maze after he died from freezing, and on the right we see Shining Jack as he appears in the photo that stands on the wall in the corridor of the hotel. So these photos are examples of repressions. On the left, what we see is the repressed memory of the violent father. And so what Danny has done is that he has voluntarily lost his father in the maze. So the maze is a symbol of the unconscious. And Jack, the frozen Jack in the maze, is like the Minotaur in the maze of Minos. He is the evil beast that is trapped in a prison. On the right, we have Shining Jack, who is also imprisoned in another maze. It is not a real maze, it is a symbolic maze that is formed by the photos on the wall of the corridor. So as we can see here, the repression is a mechanism by which a painful memory or a painful desire is sent to the unconscious through the mechanism of repression. So the advantage, the benefit of repression is that we don't know anymore what makes us suffer. It is sent in a place where we are unconscious. It's like a maze. And here we see frozen Jack with the repressed traumatic memory in the unconscious, and Shining Jack with the idealized memory of the father. Second defense mechanism that we have seen in the previous video, I will not give too much details here, just to mention briefly, is dissociation. So in the Shining movie we see a lot of dissociative states. Here we have a few examples of dissociative states. It is easy to recognize a dissociative state. You have this look of stupor, you have the eyes that are lost in the emptiness, and you see that the character seems to be absent. There is an emotional numbness. So here we see Danny as he meets the twin girls in a corridor of the hotel. Or here we have a trance, a kind of trance, when Danny is reviving the scene in room 237. Another example is Halloran in his room, another hypnotic dissociation. And here it is interesting to note that the character seems lost. He is in his bed, he is in his room, but it is as if his mind was somewhere else. Another example of dissociative state is the emotional reaction, the lack of emotional reaction of Danny as he is in the arms of his father. It should be a lovely scene, it should be something with a lot of affection, and here what we see on his face is a complete lack of emotion. A few other examples with Jack. Dissociative states with derealization, panic attack, flashback. Here it is Wendy. And a good example of schizophrenic dissociation. Not to mention the poster of the movie, who has the face of a dissociative figure. So, what is the difference between repression and dissociation? Is that in repression there is a split between the conscious and the unconscious. In dissociation there is a split inside the conscious. We know what is hurting us, we know that, but we don't know that it is about us. It is as if it was something outside of us. And as you can imagine, in dissociation, we can also talk about dissociative personalities. And this is what we will talk about now. And this will help us better understand the dynamic of characters in the movie. So before we enter in details in the analysis of characters, let's have a brief look at what is dissociative personalities in the movie. First, of course, we have Danny and his double, Tony. We can mention Jack and Delbert Grady, the loving caregiver and the evil caretaker. The woman in room 237, who first appears as a very sexy, beautiful woman, and she transforms into an ugly, rotting body. And finally, I can mention Lloyd, the bartender, who is also a projection of a kind of projection of a mental state of Jack. It is this addiction to alcohol. And what is interesting to note in these dissociative personalities is that they appear mainly in terms of mirrors. So we have a lot of mirrors in the movie, and mirrors are a clue, they give us a clue about these dissociative personalities. So the question now is, how can we reconstruct these characters? How can we better understand their dynamics? So let's start with Jack. But first, let me precise that all these split personalities are not those of the actual Jack. They are split representations in the mind of Danny. Jack is a school teacher who withdraws from the world, going to a hotel far from everything. He has drinking problem, he is verbally abusive to his wife, and physically abusive to his son. We can also mention that he is sexually abusing Danny, and we will have a few clues in a moment. Jack doesn't care about the hotel. We never see him working as a caretaker. He is self-absorbed, completely lost in the book that he is writing, and that contains nothing but his compulsive obsession. Shining Jack is the memory of Jack in the mind of Danny. He is an idealized version of his father. And he is also an ambivalent figure because he is both attractive and dangerous. So, Shining Jack is linked to the various men in tuxedo who appear throughout the film. We have several men in tuxedo, and we will see them one by one, and all these men, they are a facet of Jack. So first comes Lloyd, who expresses the alcoholic addiction of Jack. The discussion between Jack and Lloyd give a hint about what triggers Jack's alcoholism. The burden of guilt caused by his violence toward Danny. Jack also voices his marital issues, as he uses a very demeaning term to describe Wendy. He calls her the old sperm bank upstairs. He feels trapped in a double bind. Woman can't live with them, can't live without them. Alcohol gives Jack great relief and a sense of being loved. That's when he talks about credit and money. Jack is in denial of his own violence. He minimizes his physical abuse and even resents Danny. Delbert Grady comes next. He impersonates the authoritarian and violent aspect of Jack, his desire to punish what he considers as disloyalty from Danny, when he becomes aware that Danny tries to bring a protective figure, Halloran, from outside the family. Not only is it a problem of disloyalty for Jack, but in his paranoid delusion, Jack thinks that it is first intended to hurt him and not to protect Danny. Grady is also a symbol of excessive, uncontrollable anger, as he shot his wife and daughter. The third man in tuxedo is the matured man who is getting a fellatio from the man in the bear costume, while Wendy walks through the corridor. This man doesn't talk. He just sits down and stares at Wendy with a sustained gaze, which evokes seduction or guilt. The sustained seductive gaze of the man in tuxedo reminds us of the way the woman in the bathtub stares at Jack when he enters the bathroom of room 237. The man in tuxedo and the woman in the bathtub are two variants of the same idea. The positive attraction that Danny feels toward the adult, and that we can perceive in the elegance of the man and the beauty of the woman. The young woman transforms into a repellent old woman, whose body is covered with what we will call stains, which evoke the consequence of the fault, that is, the transgression that consists in kissing the young woman. By kissing Danny, the beautiful woman has made the fantasy real. She has done what should have never been done. And as a result, Danny, impersonated as Jack in the scene, now sees the sins of the woman. She doesn't appear anymore as a beautiful being, but on the opposite, as a filthy corpse. The whole scene in room 237 exemplifies what psychoanalyst Sandor Ferenczi wrote in Confusion of Tongues, his book. He wrote that children identify themselves with the aggressor, which produces the introjection of the guilt feeling of the adult. The guilt is what the stains mean on the body of the old woman. The nudity of the woman express a lack of protection, but they also express shame. So we can better understand why it is Jack who is reviving the scene in room 237. So this scene is a kind of trance dream in which Danny is reviving the aggression through the character of Jack. That is the identification with the aggressor. The man in tuxedo is also linked to Danny via the bear costume. As shown once again by Rob Egger, the bear costume is a symbol for Danny. He impersonates the sexual abuse perpetrated by Jack on Danny. The last man in tuxedo is the injured guest, whom Wendy bumps into when wandering in the corridors of the hotel. The man shows a contrast of happiness, conviviality, and madness. The wound at the top of his head showing his broken mind. What is noticeable with the injured guest is that he cannot fool people anymore. His appearance clearly shows that there's something wrong with him. Let's move on to Danny. Danny is a serious child who never seems to relax, even when he is playing a game of darts. He is suffering from obvious dissociative symptoms such as emotional anesthesia, fainting, tunnel vision, trances, visions, dissociative identity, flashbacks, or reliving the events. He has what his mother described as an imaginary friend, who Danny calls Tony. Imaginary friends are usually positive. They tend to appease children, to be part of their games, to be a source of good events. Tony, on the opposite, is associated to flashbacks, visions, and fainting. Quite the opposite of a positive experience. Also, Tony is impersonated by the movement of Danny's index finger, that is elongating and retracting as he speaks through Danny's mouth. The index is the finger in general are a symbol of the penis, and in the case of this elongating and retracting finger, it is clearly a symbol of a penis. Tony is also the name of a famous tiger character of the cereal brand Frosties. In Danny's bedroom, there's a drawing on the wall that shows Tony the tiger behind a chalkboard. The frost is an evocation of frozen Jack, and the chalkboard is a symbol for the teacher that Jack used to be. The tiger is a frightening animal, a symbol of force and uncontrollable energy. He is also a man-eater, a symbol of death, but also a symbol of foolishness and of danger. Like Shining Jack, Tony the tiger is both a loved and feared figure. He is ambivalent. To better understand the symbol of the tiger in general and the symbol of the tiger in this movie, we can use a metaphor. If the tiger would be another character, it would be the alien in the movie of the same name. So, here we have a better understanding of how these characters are composing two main characters that are Danny and Jack, and all these doubles are facets of the characters. Let's talk now about another defense mechanism that is called projection. So what is projection? Projection is that when we take something that is painful and we send it outside of us, we project it on somebody else or something else. And this allows us to avoid to suffer. This makes the event less painful. So here we have a good example of projection. It is when Wendy goes to Jack's room as he's typing his novel, and we know, she doesn't know, but we know that he hasn't written a word. He has no inspiration. And so he shows a lot of anger toward her. This anger that he shows here is the anger that he feels because of his lack of capacity to produce a book. So it is a projection of his anger that is directed to Wendy. A better example of projection is the scene with Halloran. This scene is at the beginning of the movie. It is when the Torrance family is visiting the hotel, and Halloran is a kind of guide, and he walks through the kitchen with Wendy and Danny, and at a certain time they come to a storeroom, and this storeroom is filled with a lot of food in packages. And there is a very surprising event that occurs, is that Halloran is talking to Wendy. He is explaining what is inside this storeroom, and Danny is looking at Halloran, and while Halloran is watching Danny hears a sentence as spoken that seems to be spoken out by Halloran, but in fact Halloran is not speaking to him. So what the movie is telling us, it's a kind of thought transmission. Okay, but here what we are going to analyze is the psychological interpretation of this. So first we can see that what is the trigger of this event. The trigger is the visit of the storeroom, and in this storeroom we retrieve the boxes of Frosties that we have talked about previously. There is a character, we see it on the boxes, it is Jack the Tiger. So Jack is an evocation of Jack the father. Tony the Tiger is an evocation of Jack the father, sorry. And it is the trigger. Also, during his conversation with Wendy, Halloran is talking about the cereals. And there is another trigger, is that Halloran has moved his head and is now looking at Danny. Is looking at him directly. And this stare should immediately evoke something that we have seen. We have two other characters who are staring directly at us. It is the man in tuxedo with the bear costume, with the man in the bear costume, and it is the sexy woman in room 237. So here it is a second trigger, the fact that Halloran is looking at Danny. And so these triggers reactivate something in the mind of Danny, and it is a painful thought. And he projects this painful thought outside of him. It is a dissociation. Here he hears a voice. He literally hears a voice. And what does the voice say? The voice says, "Hi Doc, do you want an ice cream?" And it's clearly a memory of the sexual abuse that he has lived with Jack. So here we have a better understanding of the character of Danny through this projection of his painful memory with Jack that is projected on Halloran. Fourth mechanism is introjection. I have mentioned it a little bit. It is identification with the aggressor that was mentioned by Sander Ferenczi. And in the introjection, what happens is that we internalize the desire and the thoughts of the aggressor. It is like a Stockholm syndrome, where the victim identifies with the aggressor. And Danny identifies so much with Jack that he is reliving the scene in room 237 as Jack. So the Jack that we see in room 237 is not the real Jack. It is the introjected Jack in the mind of Danny. So here we have a few pictures of Jack in room 237. So here what we see is that when you watch the movie, what you see is that in the scene, during the scene in room 237, we see several pictures of Danny in his bed, and he's in a state of dissociative trance. So we can elaborate that this scene in room 237 is something that happens in the head of Danny. It is a symbolic representation of a sin that occurred in the past. So in these scenes, he identifies with the aggressor as if he internalizes the desire of his aggressor. It is as if he, Danny, has the same desire for the young woman. The young woman is a figure of the father. So it is as if he was the perpetrator of the aggression in a sort of way. And at the end, Jack closes the door, he imprisons the woman. It is a first attempt of repression. So here we see Danny with his introjected character of Jack. So, who is Wendy? We didn't talk much about Wendy. The fact is that Wendy does not arouse sympathy. She is submissive. She doesn't react when Jack is so demeaning. She does everything in the hotel, and she is the true caretaker. She appears to be spineless, marked by a lack of willingness. There's something goofy in her attitude. She is also delusional about Jack. She doesn't want to see his true addiction to alcohol and his abusive behavior, not to mention his sexual aggressions. She acts like the codependent who rescues Danny while Jack bullies him. There's something childish about her. She is scared when facing the madness of Jack, even before he becomes violent. When we see her holding a bat or a knife awkwardly, it appears clearly that these objects are purely reassuring items. She doesn't really use them as defense tools, but more as a mean of reassuring her. So, what is interesting about Wendy is that throughout the film she doesn't have any vision. She doesn't live the experience of The Shining, these visions. But at the very end of the movie, she has some visions. First, she sees the man in tuxedo with the man in a bear costume, and this is an explicit sexual scene. This scene is the most realistic representation of the sexual aggression that occurred to Danny. So it is a memory that has found its way from the unconscious of Danny, and it came out to Wendy. The second thing that Wendy sees in the hotel is the aggressor. It is the guest, the injured guest. And what we can see is his head is split in half. And this wounded head is a symbol of the madness of the character. And again, it's an ambivalent character. He has some elegance, he is fancy, he is polite, but he is completely mad. And the last scene is the scene of horror with the blood coming out from the elevators. So the question is, why does Wendy experiment these visions at the end of the movie, though she has not been aware of these visions during the movie? So, first, we can notice that Wendy is very close to Danny. And in these two pictures that we see side by side, we see that Danny and Wendy, they are symbolically represented by the twin sisters. So the twin sisters, they are holding their hands. They are like Danny and Wendy when they walk in the maze. It is a proximity between Danny and Wendy. But more than a proximity, it is a kind of double. So what I say here is that Danny and Wendy are kind of double figures. If we see if we look at the two characters, we have some visual details that can lead us to more clues about this identification between Danny and Wendy. Now look at the clothes of Wendy on the left. So she has a red pullover and a blue dress, and we see her from the back. On the right, we see Danny from the back. He is on his tricycle. Now, if you look at the tricycle with the top of the trouser of Danny, it looks like a blue dress. You see the form of the back of the tricycle is like a dress. And he has also a red pullover. So, Wendy is Danny, or I should say that Danny is the inner child of Wendy. This is a story about something that happened in the childhood of Wendy.